Hey everybody, I know it's been a little while since we last touched on triage, so we're going to go ahead and do a quick refresher on the methodology used by our department and the surrounding agencies, and that'd be the RAMP mass casualty triage. Let's review on why is accurate triage so important. Well, for us specifically, it increases appropriate access to resources, and within our department and surrounding agencies, those appropriate resources are going to be ambulances. If we have 50, 60, or 100 patients, we need to determine who is the most critical patient to get those first few ambulances, which will in turn lead to better patient outcomes. And we can't forget that the frequency and size of these events is increasing. So if you look back, to Columbine and compare that to Paris, just look at those numbers. We need to be prepared for that 50, 60, 100 patient incident. And also the lethality of the incidents is increasing, meaning the overall mortality rates are getting higher. Because in the end, a second saves lives. Within the United States, specifically in mass shootings, you have a 2 to 4% increase in mortality rates for every minute until a patient receives either whole blood or surgical care. So the way we can have an impact on that is by recognizing the more critically injured of those patients and getting them into a hospital faster. With the incidents, are changing and evolving. They're not just a single mass shooter with an assault rifle. If you look back at history recently of the Nice car attack where a gentleman stole a truck and drove it down a street parade, that could very well likely happen here. Had multiple kilometers worth of victims, 86 dead, 456 wounded. China had coordinated knife attacks. There was the Paris nightclub shooting we talked about. Then you got to think about things like the Syrian gas attacks, the London chemical attacks, or even in the modern era, the concern is fire as a weapon. So imagine we're dealing with an MCI and somebody starts the Marshall Fire again, and we deal with large-scale evacuation of patients on top of dealing with a fire threat. These are things in the modern era we need to be addressing and be preparing for. So let's talk about some reasons why our triage might be less than accurate. The first one would be they never took into account the physiology of fear or that fear effect in responders when creating these algorithms. You get toned out to that big MCI, or you pull up on that big scene, you get that sympathetic response, your heart rate starts going up. Well, the problem is once you get above about 110, 120 beats a minute, you lose your ability to critically think. Above that, 120, 130, you lose your fine motor skills, so things like triage tags become ineffective. And you fall back on your basic muscle memory. That's why we train the way we do in the fire service. It also doesn't take into account, that physiology of fear, that fear effect in our patients. We're always taught if you pull on scene, first thing you do is say, if you can hear my voice, come over here. Well, the reality is a lot of those patients have already left. And if you look at like the Las Vegas shooting, the major transporting agencies were POV, Uber, Lyft, and taxi cab. So if they can leave, they've probably already left. Additionally, we take those and then I give you something like START or SALT as an algorithm, and then we expect you to be successful. And it's not realistic. So traditionally, the method everybody's probably used to using or being taught was START. And there are numerous flaws that have just never been addressed with this over the years, and yet we still continue to use it. Despite time and time again seeing after-action reviews that say triage is ineffective, we continue to use a faulty algorithm. Some of the problems with this is, one, if you just look at this, it's too complicated. You had to shrink the algorithm down to fit on a slide, and this is an algorithm that you may use just once in your career, and it'll be on the worst day of your career. I expect you to use it and be successful. It's just not realistic. Additionally, it uses respirations, which is the most lied about vital sign on every single person's run report, right? Who actually counts respiratory rates. Also, if you're supposed to do respiratory rate, you're supposed to count for 30 seconds and not let them know you're counting. So that makes for a very confusing and complicated MCI scene where I'm spending 30 seconds at each patient just counting how long they're breathing for. Additionally, it uses things like numbers. So remember back to the previous slide where we talked about the sympathetic nervous system and the response and your ability to lose critical thinking. So numbers are out the window. And finally, it uses cap refill. And cap refill is great in kids. In adults, there are some times where it might not be so effective, such as if it's cold outside, if they're wearing gloves, if it's a poorly lit environment like the Pulse nightclub. or if they have disease processes like Raynaud's, poor circulation, or diabetes. These can all impact how we would use this algorithm. So there was an attempt about 15 or 16 years ago to address START, and that's where SALT came in. And it made some improvements, though it also had some flaws. One of them being global sorting, where, if you're moving, I come to you second. If you're walking, I'll get to you last. If you're not moving, I'll go to you first, which on the outset and in theory works great. However, if I have a large or a linear scene, you're doing a lot of bouncing around and it becomes very cumbersome. And remember, seconds save lives here. How can we speed things up? That 2 to 4% mortality rate increase. So how do we get to these patients faster? Additionally, what I think would be the fatal flaws, if you look at the bottom of that algorithm, it says likely to survive given current resources. And that is determined as a red or a black. So basically live or die based on that initial triaging unit, knowing what resources are coming or on scene or are behind it. And I don't realistically expect that of my first due crews. They're going to be so overtasked with performing triage and life-saving interventions on patients that they're not going to be able to know how many ambulances are coming behind them, how many have been loaded up, how many patients can still be taken to hospitals. They're not going to recognize that, and nor do I expect them to. But that's what they're supposed to utilize to determine lives or dies, and it's not realistic, and it's putting an undue burden on the provider. So everybody's probably been trained in START or SALT triage at some point, so why they need to change? Well, those currently utilized methods are only about 55 to 65% accurate for overall appropriate triage, meaning you flip a coin basically. With SALT specifically, if I trained you on it, immediately tested you, the accuracy is only about 70%, so not great odds. Frequent training and simulations on triage, we can only expect you to get about 10% better. And I would ask you, when was the last time you had triage training? Probably a short blip here or there, or back in your paramedic or EMT school, really. It's not something we do frequently. So to say I can train you on it frequently and get you 10% better, it's not realistic. And then neither SALT or START is sensitive or specific in identifying hospital outcomes in MCI patients. And what those two terms mean in a biostatistics sense is it's not sensitive at determining who the reds are, and it's also not specific at determining who aren't the reds in regards to hospital outcomes, which is, much like cardiac arrest data, we don't care about ROSC, we care about who actually walks out of the hospital. Same thing for MCI patients is, I want to know the overall outcomes, who's surviving with a decent quality of life, and the current methods, SART and SALT, neither of them have been shown to be adequate to determine that. So why do we keep using them? So now we'll look at a few case studies on where triage has kind of let down the responder in the past. So let's start with San Bernardino, California. Had 16 deceased, 24 wounded. And what you see there in parentheses is directly taken from the after-action review interviews with the first arriving medic. So high levels of stress exacerbated by noise, water from the fire alarm, sprinklers, the smell of cordite and blood, and the screams of the victims caused a high stress environment where, no fault of his own, he kind of vapor locked. His exact quote was, "Start triage failed us." He tried to remember what to do, and that super complicated algorithm, trying to use it on the worst day of your career, it didn't work. So he adapted it, overcame, he abandoned it, and used no formal triage system and just used his own judgment. And he did a pretty good job given the circumstances. Another example is Utoya Island, Norway. This was a pretty devastating one that involved a terrorist dressing like a police officer and attacking a youth camp on a remote island, with 77 deceased and over 150 wounded, most of those being young adolescents. The triage takeaways from this one were that up until this point, there was no formal triage system used pre-hospital in Norway. They have since adapted that and now have a system, but at the time they didn't. They had an under triage rate of 43%, and most of this was attributed to the fact that triage was performed by physicians flown to the island. So they had never been trained on how to do pre-hospital triage. They did the best they could under the circumstances they had and unfortunately, it had a lower success rate than we would like to expect on an incident like this. The last little case study I want to touch on here was the London Bridge attack back in the UK in 2017, which ended 11 dead and 48 wounded, 21 of those critically. And I'd like to touch on this one because one of the triage takeaways was many of the walking wounded did in fact have serious wounds, but they were overlooked by arriving medics on scene initially because they had fallen back to what they knew, which was, if you can hear my voice, come stand over here. You're a walking wounded. I'll get to you later. And a lot of people with critical wounds were bypassed because there wasn't a good triage done on them. So it's a good reminder that just because you're walking doesn't mean you're not really messed up and in need of medical care. So deficiencies in triage have been known for a while. Back about 15 years ago, the CDC developed the Model Uniform Core Criteria, the MUC criteria. It was a project they did to try to improve triage. After a lot of work, they found that all current systems as of about 15 years ago were ineffective. And unsurprisingly, trying to do a study on triage is difficult because you need good data to get good results, and getting good data on a mass casualty where data collection is secondary is hard to do, so you can imagine that. They did, however, come away with 24 easy-to-follow criteria. If you can follow those, you have a good triage algorithm. Some of them are kind of overly complicated, but the big ones, ease of use in an austere environment, absolutely. You have to remember it. I think that's the most common sense one. And the big thing is don't use numbers or vital signs because they recognize that sympathetic response, remember back several slides back, you don't have the ability to critically think. So to add that into an algorithm will just automatically make it ineffective. So noting all these problems, with triage and how it's affected us as pre-hospital providers, I set out to build a new system. So how did I do it? Well, pulled from the best systems globally, which included some time I spent in Israel training on large-scale terrorist attacks and mass casualty medicine. I pulled from CDC recommendations, scientific journals, used a current scientific-based approach, which for EMS we're getting better. However, we've always been slow to adopt things. The prime example I always give is backboards, in that it took us so long to stop backboarding every patient, even though the data has been out there for more than a decade, that it's not always the best thing to do. I wanted to simplify it because if you can't remember it, you can't do it. And then I remembered, second saves lives and how to increase productivity and how to be more efficient. So what does the science say? Well, first thing is GCS directly correlates to hospital discharge and trauma. Great. That's a great study to cite and to help drive a new algorithm. However, we're terrible at scoring GCS. After respiratory rate, it's probably our most lied about vital sign. Looking at following basic commands as a substitute, and they looked at about 30,000 patients and found if you can follow basic commands, it's the best overall indicator of survival from trauma. It's great. That is something we definitely need to utilize when building an algorithm. Lack of radial pulse and not following commands is a 92% mortality rate. Conversely, if you can do both, if you have a radial pulse and follow commands, you have a 95% survival rate. So when you're making a new triage, that is really low-hanging fruit for your black category and your green category, right? And unsurprisingly, to anybody who's ever done this, yellow is the most inaccurate done by EMS. So eliminate inefficiencies, follow the science, and that's how I developed RAMP triage. Rapid assessment of mentation and pulse. RAMP. If you can remember the name, you can remember what to do when the day comes to actually use this. It's incredibly simple. So approach a casualty, assuming they don't have signs of obvious death. Perform your life-saving interventions, controlling massive hemorrhage, opening airway, decompressing a chest if it needs it. And then it's 2 simple steps. Do they follow commands, and do they have a radial pulse present? And if they have both, they're delayed, they're a green. So that's at 95% survival rate. If they can't do either, that's at 92% mortality rate, they're expectant or deceased. What we're looking for is those patients who can do one or the other. And that's that sweet spot in the middle. Those are those critical patients who we need to recognize quickly and remove them from the scene and get them to surgical care. Because on an MCI, we're not the ones saving lives. It's going to be the surgeons and the ERs that are saving the lives of these patients. It's our job to recognize the most critically ill and critically wounded and get them to the hospital the fastest. With this, we're really looking at physiology. We're not looking at wounding patterns. So the example I like to give is let's say you have a patient who had an IED explosion and you're in an MCI, so you have dozens and dozens of patients, and their left lower leg is blown off. They have a tourniquet on, they're not bleeding anymore, they're talking to you, so they're following basic commands and they have a good radial pulse. In this algorithm, that patient is a green. And that's true because that patient is stable for now. What we're looking for is that same patient who doesn't have a radial, who's more critical and needs to go first. What this algorithm does is it identifies the most critically wounded so you can get them off the scene the fastest. So let's quickly look at a couple of studies that were done on RAMP. The first one compared it to START, the algorithm I'm sure you're all familiar with. And this was a 19-patient scenario. I believe it was a theater shooting. Time that patient decreased by 15 seconds each patient, so it's good. They got faster. Accuracy went up to 84% from 58, so an increase of about 30% accuracy rate increase. And the most important item here from this study, the takeaway is time until all the reds were off the scene decreased by almost 10 minutes. And if you remember, I talked about, it's specifically in mass shootings, 2 to 4% mortality rate increase every minute till a patient's at a gets blood or is at a surgeon. Just by being faster, even if they weren't better, which they were because they're more accurate, just by being faster, they would have reduced mortality rates on that hypothetical scene by 20 to 40%. And that's huge. Another study that I'm going to reference is out of Australia, where they use SMART, which is basically the international version of START triage. And their time at triage cut in half from 50 to 25. Their accuracy went up to almost 100% out of this study of Australia. So it really shows the viability of this algorithm in a high-stress scenario. So what are the benefits of us using this algorithm? Well, it aids in the identification of the most severely wounded. It's easy to use. It's easy to teach. I mean, just in 15-minute talk, you'll have already learned it and been experts in it. It doesn't rely on numbers or critical thinking, so you don't have to dig deep down in your brain and try to get this to work on the day you need it. You're going to remember it. It's going to be easy. And it uses scientific evidence, which is something a lot of the things we've done in the past don't do. So you combine all of those, and it really sets forth why we should be using this triage algorithm over START. For those who like to look at references, here are all the studies and various things I cited in my talk. And even though we all work together, anybody who wants to email me, here's my email. Thanks for listening, and feel free to reach out with any questions you might have.